Welcome to Behind the Glass, the Villa Tugendhat and its family, in our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized and Banned Art based in New York. Today, I'm honored to introduce Michael Lambek, who is a cultural anthropologist with a BA from McGill and PhD from the University of Michigan. He has taught at UTSC since 1978. During 2006 to 2008, he held a split appointment with the Department of Anthropology at the London School of Economics, where he was also visiting Centennial Professor in 1997. From 2006 to 2020, he held a Canada Research Chair, Tier 1, in the Anthropology of Ethical Life, and with this was able to inaugurate the Center for Ethnography. From 2012 to 2020, he also served as chair of the Department of Anthropology at UTSC. He has graduate cross appointments in the Department for the Study of Religion and the Department of History. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2000. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Michael Lambek.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to introduce my book, Behind the Glass, the Villa Tugendhat and its Family, and give special thanks to Rachel Stern for the invitation. Rachel, the slide number 1 of the villa, please. As you can see from the subtitle, the book has two interrelated subjects. One is a house, the Villa Tugendhat, located in the city of Brno in the Czech Republic. And the other is a family, the family of Grete Tugendhat, the woman who commissioned the villa from Mies van der Rohe in late 1927, moved into it in 1930, fled from it in 1938, and revisited it briefly in the late 1960s at the invitation of Czech architect František Kalivoda. Slide 2, please. This is Grete in Brno in the 60s. The house, an icon of modernism, had been damaged by the war and subsequent neglect, and both Kalivoda and Grete were concerned about its future. In 1970, Grete offered the house to the city of Brno on two conditions, namely that it be properly restored and that it be open to the public. After she died, only a few months later, these conditions were eventually fulfilled, albeit after a long and conflict-ridden process. The villa became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2001 and was fully restored and reopened to the public in 2012. In these developments, Grete's youngest daughter, art historian Daniela Tugendhat, and her husband, architectural restorer Ivo Hammer, played a significant role. For serious lovers of architecture, I highly recommend their book on the house. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and my book is rather different. A major theme is the relationship between the house and the family, but I also trace the family many generations back before Grete, from humble beginnings in the ghetto of the small Moravian town of Boskovice to becoming wealthy textile industrialists in the latter half of the 19th century. Slide 3, please, which shows the gravestones in Boskovice. Grete's natal family set the conditions that enabled her to imagine and afford the house, and the existence of the house has shaped the family since. It is, in a sense, part of the family heritage, but it is also a means by which the family has identified itself as a family. And so the book is more abstractly about the constitution of family itself. I see the family as a product of both its representations of itself and its representations by outsiders. This is not without irony, as I too am engaged in its representation. This family is also my family. My mother, Hannah, was Grete's eldest child, a daughter from her first marriage, and she lived in the house for 8 years of her childhood. Multi-generational families are open-ended, and in the book I discuss the problems I had in framing who I was writing about and whom to include. In the end, Grete became the focal character of the book, as she was indeed a dominant personality during her life. The person most closely associated with the house, and the family member of greatest interest in Brno today. I trace back from my mother to her mother, and from my grandmother to my great-grandmother, whom I also knew and who outlived Grete, dying in 1975. This is a line through women, but Grete herself was born into a family that conceived of itself largely through men. Grete's maiden name was Löfberg, or Lobier in English, and it was the Lobier family who were especially prominent in Brno. It was Grete's father, Alfred Löfberg, who gave her the property on which the house is situated and who funded the construction. Alfred was part of a family firm, the partnership in which was passed down from father to sons. The firm was founded by Alfred's grandfather, Moses Löfberg, 5 generations before me, and then inherited and expanded by Alfred's father, Max. Slide 4 is a picture of Max and his wife, Pauline. Moses was born in 1793 in Boskowitz, a Moravian town of lively Jewish learning. He was the first member of the family to move beyond the world of the ghetto, locating his factory by a watermill in the nearby farming village of Svitavka. Moses and then his son Max, who you see pictured, became capitalist entrepreneurs and were among the many figures who developed the Moravian textile industry, an industry that came to rival the British counterpart. Its British counterpart. So slide 5, please, which is the factory, one of the factories. Moses had 2 older brothers who formed a different and equally successful textile firm, also under the name Löfberg. One of the factory buildings owned by that branch was appropriated by the Nazis and then used by Oskar Schindler to house Jewish workers during the Second World War. You may have seen the film. This was a historical accident, but one that Daniel Löfberg, a British descendant of the original owners and a 5th or 6th cousin of mine, is drawing on to turn the ruined building into another museum, commemorating both Schindler and his own family. After Max's early death in 1887, the firm belonging to my branch of the Löfbergs was inherited by his 3 sons and was astutely led by the oldest of them, Rudolf, whom I refer to in the book as its patriarch. Slide 6, please. Rudolf, with an ear, something to help him hear, which I don't think probably worked. Ear trumpet, it's called. Under Rudolf's guidance, the firm expanded from textile manufacturing to include cement, beet sugar, and cellulose factories. The family became very wealthy. Slide 7 is the grosse villa that Rudolf built in Svitavka. Yes, in Svitavka. The 3 brothers chose to marry, one after the other. They married 3 sisters, thereby constituting a very tight-knit family and consolidating resources in the firm. The sisters came from a wealthy Viennese family that also had Moravian Jewish roots. Among them, the 3 couples of married siblings produced 8 children, who were double cousins to each other, since their mothers were sisters and their fathers were brothers. These cousins, including my grandmother Grete, were raised in a kind of hothouse atmosphere and expected to live up to high ideals that came with the privilege of intelligence and wealth, and also perhaps the unspoken insecurity of anti-Semitism. Slide 8 is the Kleine Villa, which is the villa that my great-grandfather had built in Svitavka. I follow the lives of the 3 brothers and the 3 sisters who were their wives, each born and raised in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then their children, the 8 double cousins, raised in the early decades of the 20th century. I also include the 3 sisters of the Löfberg brothers and the 2 additional sisters of the 3 Löfberg wives, and all their children. The sisters were part of the family, but not of the firm, and so they were less well integrated or remembered by the descendants of the 3 brothers. The family corresponded to what historian Leonore Davidoff aptly describes as a long family in what she calls the kinship-rich class societies. It's in her book, Thicker Than Water. So slide 9 shows one of the sisters and Max's widow, Pauline. Family members formed the main participants in each other's social and psychological worlds. In the next generation, the double cousins tried to escape the confines of the family and the estate, and later they were forced to do so. But even after the diasporic spread, they remained very important to one another. The men of my great-grandparents' generation managed the factories, while the women managed the households and kinship relations in a luxurious milieu, one in which anti-Semitism was never spoken about. They thrived during the last decades of Austria-Hungary. My great-grandmother recalled dancing at the emperor's ball. But the collapse of the empire at the end of World War I and the emergence of new states like Czechoslovakia on ethno-national lines made the position of the Jews once again anomalous. Moreover, new cultural horizons emerged in the interwar period. The members of Grete and in the interwar period, the members of Grete's generation were part of a heady milieu focused now on Berlin rather than Vienna, and one in which elements of Marxism, philosophy, science, art, and architecture mixed. They seized the opportunity to explore intellectual, artistic, and political interests. The men were educated in ways that would support their positions in the firm. One of the three women earned a doctorate in psychology. Her brother Paul, the patriarch's son, Rudolf's son, became a chemist. After adventures in Berlin before the war and exile in London during it, Paul pulled together the remains of the firm in Vienna. Paul was a wealthy industrialist, but he also had strong communist sympathies. Indeed, for a time, his occupation served as a cover for acting as a small-time KGB agent. It was Paul and his doctor wife Alla, instructed by the KGB, who helped Melinda McLean and her children disappear from Switzerland. Melinda was the wife of Donald McLean, one of the famous or infamous Cambridge Five spies. Donald had earlier fled to Moscow, where Melinda and the children soon turned up. Although being Jewish was not for them a salient part of their identity, in fact, they were part of a small world of politically and intellectually active secular Jews. One of Grete's first cousins married Dora Kellner, who subsequently left him for Walter Benjamin, the famous German thinker, Jewish German thinker. Another cousin became a collector and expert in ancient Chinese art, which he kept at the family estate adjacent to the original factory in Svitavka. So slide 10, please, which shows Rudolf and Grete. Among them, Grete stood out. For her daughter Ruth, Grete had something unattainable. That is her attraction for me as well. But what is unattainable is also beyond description. So I will stick to some facts. Grete was born in 1903. As a child, she lived first in the family quarters adjacent to the factory in Brno until her parents moved into an expansive house about 1913. Her younger brother said that Grete was always best in school, punctual and precise. People respected her, and they agreed that the family genius went from Rudolf to Grete. Grete was described as gifted and strong-willed. Grete wanted children, and so she left university after a year in order to marry. She married twice, first to Hans Weiss and then to Fritz Tugendhat. The husbands were of her choosing, but both were also from textile manufacturing firms, and both had family origins in Boskowitz as well. In fact, I discovered in my research that Grete and Fritz were third cousins. Both Fritz and Hans were assimilated Jews, and Hans Weiss's siblings were intellectuals. One of his sisters married Kurt Lewin, the founder of social psychology. Another sister played a central role in identifying the autism spectrum, and a brother became an accomplished mathematician. But the sibling most critical to my story, Helene or Lene Weiss, became a student of Martin Heidegger in the 1920s, and she passed on her enthusiasm to her sister-in-law, Grete. Grete's best friend was also a student of Heidegger and one of his lovers. And here in figure 11, please, slide 11, is Kate Victorious sitting on a Barcelona chair in the Tugendhat villa. And she was Heidegger's student. Lene was a faithful scribe of Heidegger's lectures, and Grete read them avidly. In 1938, Grete and her immediate family fled Brno for Switzerland, and then in 1941 they went on to Venezuela. There, Grete encouraged her oldest son, Ernst Tugendhat, at age 15, to read Heidegger with her. At the end of the war, Ernst began sending care packages to Heidegger. He was at Stanford at the time, so he sent from the US. And in 1950, Ernst returned to Europe to become Heidegger's unofficial student and he eventually became one of Germany's most important and charismatic post-war philosophers. So slide 12, please, which is of Ernst. I devote 2 chapters of the book to these relationships, including excerpts from Heidegger's previously unpublished correspondence with Lene and Ernst's intellectual and subsequently emotional sharp turn away from Heidegger. Grete remained interested in Heidegger, and sometime in the 1960s, I recall her teaching a seminar on Heidegger. I've written that the appearance of my book represents a triumph over my ambivalence in writing it. I was born in 1950. My parents were each refugees who met in Montreal after the war. My father was penniless, and my mother had as yet inherited no money. In any case, the bulk of what she might have inherited was materialized in the house in Brno. Neither of my parents cared for money or show. Our one luxury was that we were invited to Europe by Grete every 3 summers, and there I encountered a world of wealthy, cosmopolitan, and ostensibly self-confident and self-important people who intrigued me and whom I felt I could never aspire to equal. Grete had relocated from Caracas to Switzerland in 1950, and I loved the exceptional modern house she built there. I began thinking about the project in the mid-1980s, interviewed a few elderly relatives, and visited the Villa Tugendhat in Brno in 1988 when it was still in communist hands. But for a long time, I did not believe the project was one I was capable of carrying out. There were so many relatives who were smarter and more knowledgeable than me. I was also concerned that the book be professional and not merely a vanity project. Slide 13, please, a family reunion. 3 events pushed the book forward. First, in 2009, the British novelist Simon Mauer published a novel entitled The Glass Room. You may have read it. It's a piece of fiction, but one character is real, namely the house. The book includes an architectural drawing that makes it evident. My mother was long deceased, but her 2 youngest sisters, born in Venezuela and just a few years older than me, were incensed by the book and subsequently the trashy movie, which Roger Ebert called architecture porn. They felt readers would identify the main characters and their sexual escapades as my grandparents, a fact that unfortunately was borne out by the comments the guides at the Tugendhat Villa received from visitors. I decided this was an opportunity to tell the real story. The second event was an invitation to spend an academic year at the Wissenschaftskolleg, an institute of advanced study in Berlin. On our first day, we went around the table to say what our intended projects were. Sociologist Rogers Brubaker mischievously said, "Why not indulge and take the year to do your fantasy project?" Rogers followed his own formidable scholarly work ethic, but 2 other fellows began family projects, and I too was able to draw on the staff to learn my grandmother's address in Berlin during the years she met Mies, and subsequently to access the German literary archives in Marbach, where the correspondence between Heidegger and Helene Weiss and also Ernst Tugendhat is stored. The third event, and the one I record in detail in the book and that you can see on the slide, was that the city of Brno issued an invitation to the Tugendhat and Lobier families to a multi-day reunion in the spring of 2017 to celebrate the restoration of the Villa Tugendhat, as well as the house of Grete's parents, Alfred and Marianne Lobier. They were expecting maybe 20 guests, but over 100 people who identified as members of the family showed up. It was a great chance to see relatives, meet new ones, and learn from our hosts about the houses, the family legacy, and Brno. I conducted informal interviews with family participants, and I returned the following year, along with fellow anthropologist David Hennig, himself born and raised in post-war Czechoslovakia, to interview city officials and others who had been involved in organizing the reunion. This led to many new insights as to how the house and the family are acknowledged in the city today, including the way in which our family has come to stand for what they call the missing Jews, most of whom had been too poor and too poorly connected to flee in the late 1930s, as most but not all of my family managed to do, and hence who were murdered in the camps. There is some embarrassment in this highly secular family coming to represent Jews, not to mention the living survivors coming to represent the murdered. Nevertheless, progressive citizens of Brno drew on us to recall and restore cosmopolitanism, thereby countering the xenophobia regnant in the country. Slide 14 shows a city meeting at which my aunt spoke, and you can see the large crowd who attended. There was also another room full of people. Among other things I learned was the following paradox of history. During the Austro-Hungarian period, once Moravian Jews were let out of the ghettos in the 1840s, they rapidly shifted from Yiddish to German speaking, and they became just another minority in the multicultural empire. The Freuds were one such family, and indeed an aunt of Freud's wife, who had married a Lobier, helped the Freud family financially. But when the empire collapsed at the end of World War I and was was replaced by ethno-national states, the position of the Jews became ambiguous. At first, Brno was divided not so much by religion, that is, between Christians and Jews, nor by ethnicity, between Czechs and Jews, as by language, between Czech speakers and German speakers. Many Jews maintained strong ties with Vienna and were part of the urban German-speaking elite. Hence, they became identified by ethnic Czechs as German, and hence eventually as part of the enemy. And this at the very time when the Jews were becoming targets of German anti-Semitism. In other words, they got it from both sides. When World War II ended, Jews were not welcome to return home or get their property back unless they could prove to have been Czech-speaking before the war. Those Jews who did return or who had survived the war at home suffered greatly from renewed communist anti-Semitism. As city official Moimir Yeradebek put it to David and me, those Jews who left after 1968 had by then, quote, a well-developed sense of historical pessimism. The situation was no doubt different in pre-war Prague, where many, though not all Jews, were Czech speakers. In her posthumous book, Still Pictures, the brilliant New York writer Janet Malcolm illustrates her roots in such a family and describes the diasporic community of Czech speakers in post-war New York as united by language more than by anything else. But no less than the Czech-speaking Jews of Prague, the German-speaking Jews of Brno had been committed to the democratic First Republic of Czechoslovakia. In the case of my family, it's evident in the construction of new houses well into the 1930s. Younger members of my mother's generation were sent to Czech schools, and her uncle Hans spoke Czech as a result of service in the army. Hans was the last family member to escape in 1939, and I expect his facility in Czech helped him get out. Incidentally, Hans returned briefly after the war to rebury his father, my great-grandfather Alfred, who had been killed at the border in 1939 during his own attempt at escape, and who was the subject of a book by the British spy Sir Paul Dukes. It's called An Epic of the Gestapo. So slide 15, please, of the house. Our welcome in Brno was partly an acknowledgement of Grete's gift to the city, but it also raised the awkwardness of property and ownership. Whatever its market value as real estate or as an art object, the house has immense symbolic capital. It is an epitome of architectural modernism, and it's important both for Czech cultural pride and as an international tourist destination, with the revenue and prestige that brings. It was used for official state receptions and was even the site where Czechia and Slovakia negotiated and issued their official divorce. It also has symbolic capital for the family, many of whom are proud of the association. And it has moral value. As city officials told Grete's family, even if we are not the legal owners, morally it is still partly ours. It functions in the way that French anthropologist Marcel Mauss famously described the gift, as an inalienable object that contains its donor. The donor was and is Grete, hence her salience, but has come to include her descendants since we too acknowledge the donation and don't try to get the house back, if you like. And this despite the fact that realistically, on both legal and economic grounds, we had little alternative. It's a gift that was accepted by the city and can never be fully reciprocated. The party the city threw for us was a kind of return, materially, but more important, ethically, an act of acknowledgement of our existence. Slide 16, please, which is a portrait of Grete done by her husband Fritz in the Tugendhat house. a photographic portrait. The Villa Tugendhat is currently simultaneously both a museum and its object. It is, in effect, a museum of itself. But insofar as it also contains Grete, there has been some tension between curators and family members as to whether what is exhibited is only the aesthetic form and technical innovations of the building, or also the family that commissioned, owned, and lived in it. And if the family as well, how are we then to be depicted? There's a risk that Grete is represented as a luxury-loving consumer, thereby ignoring and even reversing what were central to her values and her lifestyle, a mode of living that was relatively ascetic and deeply serious. Another perplexing issue for the family is that visitors to the villa have reported that for some of the time, the guides continued to obscure the reasons that Grete left the house and to deny that her descendants exist. Generous acknowledgement then goes hand in hand with stubborn refusal, a blockage that has historical, political, and not merely personal significance. In fact, the house has always had public significance. I'd now like to read lightly edited excerpts from the book that illustrate this and that focus on Grete. Born in 1903, Grete married young, but after giving birth 4 times and with only my mother surviving beyond the first few days, she moved with my mother temporarily to Berlin in 1927, divorced Hans Weiss, and immediately married Fritz Tugendhat, requesting the wedding gift of a house from her father back in Brno. Grete was deeply interested in both philosophy and art and wanted to break from the ornate houses and heavy furniture that then characterized the life of rich people. In Berlin, she attended soirees at the home of communist art historian Eduard Fuchs. His house had been designed by Mies van der Rohe for the art collector Hugo Perls in 1911 to 12. And so at the age of 25, Grete encountered the early work of Mies. Grete, Fritz, and Mies came to a common understanding of what they wanted. Thereafter, Grete left Mies on his own. She felt that he should express himself completely, observed her brother Hans. The architecture historian Dietrich Neumann writes, quote, Mies had been given the creative and financial freedom to create a classic Gesamtkunstwerk, that is, a total work of art, where everything from the building itself down to the furniture, curtains, and door handles was selected and designed by himself and Lily Reich. Mies carefully chose the material for the solid, honey-colored onyx doré wall, and he made a special trip to Paris to find the right kind of Macassar wood. End of quote. However, in fact, Mies and Reich each consulted with Grete and Fritz as they designed the furniture and decor. Slide 17 is an example of the chair that was designed for the house called the Brno chair. As Neumann further writes, quote, the radical innovation in the spatial functional arrangements was equaled by the use of new materials and the application of recent technologies. Neumann mentions the chromium plating, the opal glass, and the white linoleum, which, quote, had the photogenic effect of a space whose floor and ceiling seemed of equal brightness. There is a replacement of load-bearing outside walls with floor-to-ceiling glass, which must have struck many contemporary visitors as shockingly new. The glass, onyx, ebony, and the chrome plating produced a play of reflected light, creating what Dani and Ivo have called an effect of immateriality. Great attention was paid to the quality of both the materials and the craftsmanship. As Dani put it, quote, the furniture, including desks and tables, were of irreducible simplicity in form and owed their appeal to the perfect proportion, exclusive materials, and beautiful finishes. The value that was previously conveyed by decorating details was transformed entirely into the material, close quote. Each piece of furniture had its precise place. Although the materials were luxurious, the house exemplified the famous remark attributed to Mies that less is more. It's not quite true that no personal requests were included. Grete asked for direct access to the children's rooms, and Fritz requested a dart room and a film projection room. Grete also insisted on sun awnings over the windows. However, when Fritz questioned the tall floor-to-ceiling doors, Mies said that they were central to his vision and non-negotiable. The family moved in during early December 1930. Mies came to inspect in February 1931. He and his associate wore Homburg hats and trench coats, reminding my mother after the fact of the FBI. The older generation never indicated how they felt. I heard no mention of Rudolph's opinion, only that he always held Grete in high esteem. And as for Alfred, he was not very enthusiastic, said his son, but he let his daughter go her own way. She was a very strong personality and knew what she wanted. Slide 18, please. This is the Barcelona Pavilion. Donnie told me that when her mother commissioned the house, she had a sense that she was contributing to modern architecture. Mies was still relatively unknown, and the Barcelona Pavilion, designed over the same period as the house, was not yet finished and still unacclaimed, and it did not influence Grete. The pavilion appeared in the 1929 Barcelona International Exhibition, was dismantled in 1930 and reconstructed in 1983 to 6. It's a beautiful building. The house was started at the same time, excuse me. The house was startling at the time for its open concept on the public floor, its huge windows in place of walls, its use of materials, the steel, chrome, travertine, and glass, its unified heating and air conditioning system, and its absolute precision. Slide 19, please. That shows my two uncles at the window. Not only were these the first floor-to-ceiling windows in a family home, but unlike virtually any since, they retreated into the floor at the press of a button. Grete wrote, quote, "Everyone in Brno assured us during the construction that because of the large windows, we would freeze to death. In fact, on sunny winter days, the sunlight falling through the 10-millimeter plate glass windows heated up the lower room so much that even when it was very cold outside, we did not have to heat it. We would even lower the large window panes electrically, sitting as if in the open." The room contained a partition made of translucent onyx from the Atlas Mountains that glowed red when the sun struck it, and a dining alcove encircled by panels of Makassar ebony, which later lined a Gestapo bar and subsequently a student canteen before they were rediscovered and recovered. I just say something about the photo there. The boy has one of the boys has his feet resting on the metal bars underneath, which actually contained hot water to help make sure that the windows remained clear. And he's obviously heating his feet, in fact. Anyway, here's how Grete remembered the house in her speech of 1969. "I'd always wanted a spacious modern house of clear and simple forms. After we decided to have a house built, we made an appointment with Mies van der Rohe, and from the very first moment we met him, it was clear to us that he should be the one to build our house. So impressed were we by his personality. Above all, the way he talked about architecture gave us the feeling that we were dealing with a true artist." He added that a house should not be built starting from the facade, but from the inside, and that the windows in a modern building should no longer be holes in a wall, but fill the spaces between floor and ceiling, thereby becoming elements of the structure. Slide 20, please, which is the dining area. Quote, "Early afternoon on New Year's Eve, we expectantly entered Mies's studio to see the designs. We were due for a New Year's Eve celebration with friends, but instead the meeting with Mies went on until 1 o'clock in the morning. First, we saw the plan of an enormous room with a curved and a rectangular freestanding wall. We immediately realized that the room was something unheard of, something never seen before. Mies designed a round table whose steel leg of exactly the same shape as the steel supports of the house was lowered into the floor. The tabletop was made of black pear wood, and on its underside were metal bars with inserted slats on which circular segments were put, so that the table could be enlarged twice while retaining its circular form. When fully extended, the table could accommodate 24 people and looked extremely festive. We moved in at the beginning of December 1930. We loved the house from the very first moment." Slide 21, please. That's my mother and her two brothers, Herbie and Ernst. In her book, in which this speech has been published, Grete's daughter, Daniela, humanizes the house, deliberately including pictures taken by her father, like the one you see. He was a very gifted photographer, and he showed the family life within the house. The photographs are a significant part of how the house and the family have been represented since. As Daniela points out, quote, photographs which show buildings without their inhabitants present a merely formal and aesthetic view of architecture. Architectural photography is invariably more than the simple objective images of architecture. It is also an interpretation of it. Slide 22 gives an illustration of this. From the start, the Brno house was subject to public debate. In 1931, it was discussed in the Werkbund Review Die Form. Walter Riesler saw the house as, quote, indicative of a new spirit and even of a new humanity. To which Justus Beer replied, surely one has to agree, with the impression of an extremely high and refined spirituality, but will the dwellers, one is bound to ask, be able to support such relentlessly elevating splendor for long without inner resentment? The style of the Tugendhat house is wonderfully pure, but is it not, in its severity and monumentality, unbearable to live in? Is it not representative in the true and proper sense of the word, befitting reception halls such as the Barcelona Pavilion, but not a private residence whose inhabitants would be forced to live in a showroom, dwarfing their individual lives? Close quote. For his part, Roger Ginsberger wrote of immoral luxury, comparing it to a church or palace whose aim is, quote, to give the impression of affluence, of particularity, of something never experienced before, instead of the experience of comfort and coziness. In this, paradoxically, the Marxist critic agreed with the subsequent National Socialist inhabitants during the war who tried to divide the main room to create what they called a cozy German parlor. Ginsberger continued, are you allowed to simply walk through the house, or do you have to stalk and strut? Slide 23, please. This is Fritz's photo of the same view of the living room. Leaving aside the peculiar German fixation with spirituality, this debate had partly to do with the place of aesthetics in the modernist move to architectural functionalism, and partly the sense in that period that architecture could be a key force for change. The deeper discomfort was a social one, namely with the radical openness of the design, both of the interior spaces to one another and to the outside, in the face of the idea that people needed small and fully enclosed spaces to feel at home. Moreover, the critics implied that the inhabitants would be self-conscious, forced as it were into a permanent state of representation. The critics grossly underestimated my grandparents. Each of them published replies emphasizing their affinity with Mies and his architecture. Grete wrote that, quote, Mies is trying to restore the primary spiritual sense of life to its proper place, beyond the mere necessities. She noted, the central point of Mr. Beer's criticism is that the pathos of the interior space compels the inhabitants to representational being. Whereas we can now see this being subject to representation as having become an ironic burden of the family, Grete replied in 1931 that, quote, I never experienced the room as possessing pathos. I find them large and austerely simple. However, not in a dwarfing, but in a liberating sense. And later she writes, the large room, precisely because of its rhythm, has a very particular tranquility, which a closed room could never have. She concludes, we love living in this house so much that we find it difficult to go away and are relieved to leave cramped rooms behind us and return to our large, soothing spaces. In his reply, Fritz asserted that, quote, technically, the house possesses everything a modern person might wish for, and he compliments the resort to function by adding, whenever I let these rooms and all they contain take their effect, I'm overcome by the feeling that this is beauty, this is truth. Truth, there are many ways of looking at it, but anyone seeing these rooms will sooner or later come to the conclusion that here is true art. Close quote. In 1934, Grete published another essay, this time on the trust between architect and client, who, quote, should share the same basic feeling of being. She writes, I also believe that beauty in architecture and elsewhere can never be calculated, but always has to be created anew. Some people still criticize the house. A German architect recently speaking to me likened the openness to the invention of the bikini, that is, to exposure. This view is entirely contrary to my grandparents' way of thinking. Indeed, in turning to metaphor, Dani said that the house was like a garment for her parents. The house substantiated what they stood or strived for. It was clear rather than either cozy or uninhibited, and it certainly did not violate the inhabitants' privacy. Quote, "It structures my mind," Grete said. When people challenged how one could live in a house like this, Grete said it helped her thinking. While the house could be restful and comfortable, it also posed a challenge to its inhabitants to live up to their ideals. It kept them challenged. Dani makes an astute comparison between the sources of Mies' ideas in Thomas Aquinas and in the theologian Romano Guardini, and those of her parents in Heidegger, finding the correspondence between Mies and Heidegger, quote, "stunning." Guardini felt that, quote, "the forces of technological progress had to be bridled to leave enough room for life." He strove for a new, unified consciousness, a totality which could overcome modern age subjectivism, but could neither be grasped by rational thought nor by intuition alone. According to Mies, the crucial task of the architect is not of a practical, technical, or formal nature, but essentially philosophical. Mies is concerned with the nature of building, with its spiritual side, with truth. It never becomes clear, however, Dani says, what he precisely means by words like spiritual or truth. Both Heidegger and Mies, citing Augustine, refer to beauty as the shining of truth. Moreover, for Mies, to represent the zeitgeist in architecture was a moral question. As journalist Fiona McCarthy in a Guardian article of 2012 writes, Mies was a formidable philosopher-architect, imbued with a belief in architecture as a moral question of truthfulness. Robert Hughes, the late art critic, saw Mies's great importance in his period as bringing his individual buildings, quote, "closer to the status of a pure idea than any 20th century architect had yet done." It's worth remarking that in the late 1920s, Ludwig Wittgenstein helped design his sister's house in Vienna, a house that, in the words of Hans Sluga, quote, "shuns all decoration and all reminders of the architectural styles of the past. Aesthetic values are, instead, to be realized in pure architectonic form." In pursuit of this ideal, Wittgenstein dedicated himself to the design of the smallest details, the exact height of the ceilings, the metal and glass doors, the glass-enclosed elevator showing the inner mechanics, the door handles, the vents of the underfloor heating system, the radiators, even the feet on which those radiators stood. Austerely minimalistic, and there were bare light bulbs hanging from ceilings instead of chandeliers, the house is indubitably a specimen of cultural modernism. It is also, however, a direct expression of the Tractatus. One of Ludwig's younger sisters, indeed, called it logic turned into a house, not a human habitation. The last remark, of course, is reminiscent of responses to the Tugendhat house. But unlike Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, Heidegger's concept of truth is not logical, but poetic. Quote, "In the presence of the temple, truth is happening." With this is not meant that something is being correctly presented and represented, but that being as a whole is being brought into unhiddenness and held in it. However, the relation of Mies's house to Heidegger's subsequent ideas of dwelling is at best an ironic one. For Heidegger, the Wohnung, the dwelling, is precisely not an open modern house, but the rough forest hut or cozy Bavarian farmhouse. And perhaps it is a place of dwelling made safe by the expulsion of those unlike oneself. As my son Simon put it, Grete's house can be understood as a critique of fascism and German primordialism, a rejection of things connected with the past and a vision of a future devoid of national sentimentalism. Thus, the affinity between the architecture of Mies and the philosophy of Heidegger is something that Heidegger himself likely would have rejected. Where Mies exemplifies the modern, Heidegger turns to a romanticized pre-modern past. The former, where things are at stake, as they were for Grete, pushes one to think. The latter enables one to sink into the comfort of the known and unquestioned. Dani herself writes that from her perspective, quote, The Tugendhat house is an ideal architectural expression of my parents, at least how I saw and experienced them. Also in their ambivalence. On the one hand, there was the admirable striving towards spirituality and truth, which, on the other hand, implied an attitude of excessive strictness and demands. Donnie adds, the message of this house is absolute perfection. Slide 24, please. Let me conclude by saying that my grandparents' ideals also raised enormous challenges for me. Challenges at once empirical, aesthetic, and ethical, as I tell my story of the family who commissioned and inhabited the house. With respect to the ethical, forms of representation, memoir, family biography, history, autoethnography, museum displays, in whatever mix, raise tough questions concerning voice and silence, truth and tact. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was a very rich talk, and gives a lot of directions to think into, and to discuss. So we have a bit time now, so please, everyone, put your questions in the Q&A. I'm wondering, as you formulated so strongly the meaning of the building as an architectural icon, about as an expression of spirituality and truth. I'm just wondering what the house, and the house being more in the family consciousness, did to your family. Did it bring you together, or did it what I'm sure it had all kinds of effects, but how what do you think are the main aspects?
Well, on the one hand, it brought us together, if only by that picture of the 100 people coming to see the house. But on the other hand, it did create a bit of conflict. Not everybody was as devoted to the house as Dani was, and her sister Ruth was also, but Ruth's husband was not so much. And if you watch the film House Tugendhat, which is a German film, but in English as well, you can see that my cousin says we should just burn it down, because he worried that it was destroying his mother's and his aunt's life at the time, because they were so concerned with it. There was really a lot of conflict and struggle that Donnie and Eva went through in Brno, and it's never quite over. So, and there was conflict over how we as a family were represented there as well. And so some people take the house very seriously and consider it very important. And other people, especially younger generations, think we're just overly obsessed with it and just forget about it and go on with our lives in North America, right?
Well, that's the whole spectrum, huh?
Yeah.
So somebody's asking, anything to say about Heidegger's Nazism and anti-Semitism?
Well, so that's an interesting question. Some people have criticized me for putting Heidegger in the book at all, but the fact of the matter is he clearly was an anti-Semite, but he was very kind to my great aunt when she was dying of cancer in Basel. He sent her cards, and he actually came to Basel to visit her when she was on her deathbed. And so there's more to it than that. When it turned out with personal relations was different from his larger point of view. He was also extremely fond of my uncle, who was in fact also very kind to him in the early years before he turned away from him. And so one puzzle for me was why my grandmother and my uncle were so infatuated by Heidegger, and indeed why many Jews were. Many of Heidegger's students were Jewish, right? And also Lena defended her dissertation in Basel, because at the time in Freiburg it was no longer possible to defend theses. And Heidegger, rather than simply pushing her out, wrote a letter to the professor in Basel asking him please to take on this student and finish her dissertation for her. So there's a little bit more to Heidegger than all the negative stuff, which is certainly there. But I'm on the side, there's a lot of debates about Heidegger, but I'm on the side of saying we should distinguish his philosophy from his politics as much as we can.
Yeah, and then there are personal relationships, which might be a whole whole different story. Yeah. So Susan is asking, I have been to the Tugendhat Villa and was really struck by the neighborhood. I'd never seen exterior shots of the house with its neighborhood buildings. It's remarkable to see the house in context. It was a treat to see the villa. The onyx partition is memorable. If I understood correctly, Michael's mother lived for 8 years in the villa. Did she ever say how the villa affected her, perhaps in her aesthetics, or how the house influenced how her family lived? You mentioned they were secular. Did they celebrate any Jewish holidays? Were they part of any synagogue in Brno? Interesting that they didn't think of converting. So
They didn't think of converting. They didn't want to be Christians at all, but they were secular, and they did have a Christmas tree in the house. There are photographs somewhere of the Christmas tree in the house. On the other hand, the nanny, who's one of the main informants about this period, recalls Grete getting a phone call from her mother one day saying, "Keep the kids out of school today. It's Yom Kippur." So there was some sense of Jewishness. And later on, my grandmother and great grandmother also gave money to Jewish charities. My grandmother, Greta, was also very much involved in helping refugees who were streaming into Brno during the 30s from Poland and Germany and elsewhere. So they were very politically aware. My mother was a child, and for her, the main drama of the house was her relations with her mother and her stepfather. Her stepfather, Fritz, was not actually all that kind to her. So, and she loved her brothers, and she loved her mother, and she loved her family. And for her, the big shock was that when the Anschluss came, she had a German passport because of her father was a different father, and he had been German. So her father, who had already emigrated to England, came and within 24 hours swept up my mother, and she barely knew him, and took her off to England. So that was a very traumatic experience for her, which I describe in the book, and that shaped her life quite a bit. And my mother was an aficionado of modern furniture, but she was not, and so we had some Danish modern when she could afford it. But and she liked the house, but she wasn't overly sentimental or reminiscent about the house at all. She did visit it near the end of her life. She had multiple myeloma and was very much in pain, but she went to the house with Donnie shortly before she died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, she also was a child, right? So she remember it was just where they lived, right?
It was just where they lived. She said, I put some quotes in the book about this. I think she said she could see the difference when she went to visit friends after school, that their houses were very different and so on. But
yeah.
the children spent much of their time in their rooms, playing in their rooms, and the bedrooms were much more traditional in style, actually. They also had the wonderful lawn to play on, and they had a terrace outside their rooms where they could play as well. So she had very fond memories.
Yeah. Yeah. I would like to pedal back a little bit. I'm just wondering how much Mies van der Rohe mixed into the interior. You said about putting up a Christmas tree, and like, was the family free to where to put it, or did he keep?
Yeah,
No,
I
I
think they
know.
were, but
Yeah.
when he came to when he came to visit, which was a couple of times, I think they quickly put everything back in place so he wouldn't be upset. But I mean, one thing that you could see in those photos is a statue by Lambek. And the
Mhm.
Lambek statue was not part of Mises' design. My grandmother chose it and put it there. And it has a very interesting history because it disappeared after the war. And when she went back in the 60s, it wasn't there. And she tried to get somebody to figure out where it was. She thought that it had been stolen by the Nazi occupants of the house. Later, it turned out that it was hidden in the Moravian Museum in Brno. The Czechs had kept it hidden from the family. And my aunt Donnie was furious about this, and she decided, well, we were going to take this. This was the one piece of property we were going to take. It didn't have to be in the house because it wasn't part of Mises' original design in any case. So she got lawyers and got it out of the country, and it went to Sotheby's to be auctioned, and the Czechs bid for it. But it went for a much higher price than anybody imagined to it. Some anonymous collector in New York who may be on the Zoom, I don't know. And uh, and the Czechs were very upset about this, and they wrote in the Czech news, it was written in Czech newspapers, here's typical greedy Jews stealing Czech heritage. So some of that stuff still went on alongside with the very, very positive vibes we've received from the city of Brno and its mayors and so on. So there are always two sides to this.
At the same time as well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's quite stressful. Yeah, I was wondering, like, when I looked at the house and at different pictures online, I was wondering, like, for example, the curtains, they are curtains, and they seem to have the color seems to have changed like multiple times. So, and you mentioned like Mies van der Rohe had certain things, or Grete mentioned certain features to be important to her, and with some Mies gave in, and others he said this is non-negotiable. So I think that's really actually a pretty perfect collaboration.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to suggest. I'm sorry, I don't remember what color the curtains were originally, but they were made of silk I'm pretty sure, and probably Lily Reich designed them and chose the materials, I would imagine. And so they closed the curtains over the big windows at night. Again, it's not a matter of just being there for the public to see everything. Besides which, I didn't really talk about this, but the house is at the top of a hill, and there's a long green going down the hill, and at the very bottom of the hill, it was the house of her parents, Alfred and Marianne, which is there. So they were connected by this long garden, and my mother would run down the garden on her way to school every morning. So to talk about that, it is a very nice neighborhood indeed. And there were also, it was the house of one of greatest aunts very close by on the street as well, which has now also been turned into a kind of commemorative space. And they've just put up Stolpersteine there and so on. So,
So yeah, wow. So Susan is saying the amount of modernist building in Brno between the wars makes it hard to understand why the villa was so controversial. And I, yeah,
yeah. Well,
I,
the really modernist buildings was the exhibition space, which is still in Brno, and one can visit it, and it's really quite remarkable. And I think Mies, when he came to Brno, was very impressed by the modernism there too. And one of the things about Brno, it was a very modern city, and people in Brno did not criticize, ordinary people did not criticize the house. Whereas when my grandmother built her house in St. Gallen in Switzerland, it got terrible reviews as being really ugly and so on. And yet it was a stunningly beautiful modern house. But people of St. Gallen were just much more provincial. The citizens of Brno were not provincial at all, by and large. It was a city that was exploring all kinds of things. And there are several other modern houses there too. So the reunion that I talked about was also for another family who had another modern house in the city as well. Not so many of them attended, but they were there as well. So yes.
very fascinating. Carla is asking whether you can please explain the wall in the living room. I feel like the layout is pretty open, right?
So it's pretty open. So the onyx, uh, it's not, I mean, it's a wall, but it's an architectural feature. You can circle around it. It doesn't attach to any outside walls or other walls, right? It separates the living area from what was the study, which has a desk and bookshelves and so on and so forth. So it's not literally a wall in the sense we think of it. And the roof, as I hope I explained, was supported by these steel columns, which were chrome plated, not by the outside walls. The walls were not load bearing.
Wow.
All right, it was the steel columns. That was again one of the innovative things. You know, there was many technological things that are remarkable in this house, and that still are unusual today.
Yeah. So Jonna is asking whether the house was simply empty during the war and communist
No,
years,
no,
or
not at all, not at all. So during the war, a family called Messerschmitt, who were not the Messerschmitts that we think of, but with a slightly different spelling, moved in. They were war manufacturers as a family, and the daughter speaks of this on the film House Tugendhat and describes the cozy parlor they needed to produce there. Okay, completely unaware of the family they displaced or anything like that. Then the communists, it was then used as it was after the war that, well, at the end of the war, Russian soldiers came and occupied it briefly. Then it was turned into a dance studio during the communist period, and then into a kind of osteopathic hospital, which was a very good use of it. And again, in the film, many Czech women who stayed there at the time have very fond memories of the house. But the windows were had a lot of panes. There wasn't big plate glass at that period, but it did have a good use. And then it was becoming run down, which is why people became to get involved and because my grandmother had said the condition of the city keeping it was that it be kept in good shape, and it was not in good shape at all. So there were lots of plans made, and lots of international groups came together to try to put it back together. And when nothing was happening, actually our family threatened to take it back, but we couldn't afford it, and we couldn't have afforded to keep it up. And besides, imagine if we had never left, if there hadn't been a war and we'd stayed there, who would have received the house of Grete's 5 children? I mean, I don't know how that would have ever been resolved. So in a way, we were kind of lucky that it didn't come to us. And we also tried to get for a while somebody to create a kind of a trust for it. We approached I think my family approached Estee Lauder's son, I forget his name, who's been involved in that kind of work. But in the end, the checks came through, the city came through, and everything worked out beautifully.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. And so somebody is asking, we're going a little bit over time. I hope that's fine with you.
It's fine with me.
Like just three more questions. Does the house, and that connects exactly with that, does the house invite the family's input into how they show the house, since there seems to be some tension there?
Donnie and Ivo have had a lot of input, and actually the main curator kind of resents us at some point. But they're really interesting struggles. If I have a minute or two, I'll tell you one. And so the dining table, it's shown completely extended. And some of my family members think it should be shown very at the smallest size because that's how the family used it. Again, there's a tension about how and what the family is represented here. So when we visited it during the reunion, there were no personal artifacts in the house except in the basement. There's a first storage room, and there were several fur coats hanging there. Well, my grandmother didn't go around wearing fur coats, so that's a symbol of kind of the ostentatious, showy Jewish woman stereotype, right? So we asked to have them removed, and they were very grudging about it. In the end, they left one or two there, I think. But so we did have a quarrel about that, and all that was filmed, by the way, by the city the filmmakers employed by the city to film the reunion. So it can all be viewed somewhere.
Oh, that's interesting. So Naomi's asking, from a Torontian who traces her family back to Moravia since 1777, would you know where the Laubers resided prior to Moravia?
Well, I trace them back in the book back in the 1700s to Moravia, but then I do something. I go and look at rabbinical genealogies. I connect them to a rabbi, and I take them back to Adam and Eve. Actually, I can trace them back. So it's 127 generations, I think it is. But as far as I know, they were in Moravia for a very long time. There's some story that we're related to the Rabbi Le of Prague, which is Bohemia, right? So, but the rabbinical families moved around a lot in Europe, right? They moved continuously. Yeah. So there's no one location. And when tracing back to Adam, what I'm trying to do is be ironic about the whole idea of origins, as if one can find origins. It's also tracing back entirely through men and not through women, right? So it's really a complete artifact.
Right. So Sherry, this is the last question. Sherry is asking, is wondering how you have felt when in the house. Inspired, comfortable, or always conscious of its meaning, stature, and importance?
Well, I mean, I've never lived in the house, right? I've only been there on sort of formal occasions. The first time I was taken there, snuck in by some neighbors during the communist period, and it was kind of didn't look very nice, actually. I mean, the room was spectacular, but the furnishings were not nice and so on. So I think I've always been conscious that I'm in this house, and and it's not my house, and I don't know, but I don't have a strong answer to that question.
Okay. Very good. So thank you so much, Michael. So many of our of the comments really thank you so very much for your talk and speaking about your family and the story of your family and the villa. And Susan is also thanking you for introducing Lily Reich, who she didn't know about, who worked together with Mies van der Rohe. So
she worked closely with him, and she was probably his romantic partner for a time, but he left her behind when he went to, as far as I know, when he went to move to the US. I don't know what happened to her during the war, unfortunately. I'm sure somebody knows because she was a very well-known designer.
Yeah, yeah. So, I want to conclude not only with thanking you, but also with good news, because the University of Toronto Press agreed to a 25% discount on the hardcover and ebook formats of Michael's book with the code Lambek 25. And I put the link actually in the chat. So thank you so much for Michael. I wish everyone quiet days ahead, peaceful days ahead, and wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank everybody for listening.